Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story that's as old as time, but as oddly entertaining as a late-night snack you didn't ask for. Imagine yourself sitting on the edge of a creaky wooden chair, the faint buzz of a restless fan mixing with the distant hoot of an owl outside your window. You probably won't survive this without a few surprises, because history isn't just dusty dates. It's forgotten scandals and moments so bizarre they make reality TV look tame. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's kind of fun knowing who's traveling through time with us tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're trudging through a dimly lit stone corridor. The air smells faintly of soot, with a sharp tang of old iron and something vaguely medicinal, clove oil or dried herbs maybe, something a healer left behind. Torches flicker against mossy walls. Welcome to the late Middle Ages, where paranoia wore chainmail and virtue had a hardware problem. You've heard the story before. Some fair maiden, probably noble-born, locked into an iron chastity belt by her paranoid husband as he rode off to war. That's the myth, but let's nudge it aside for a second and gently pry open the lesser-told tale, the one where it wasn't women being locked up, but men. Yes, you heard that right. In a world obsessed with control, over land, over thoughts, and over bodies, some medieval men strapped themselves into intricate devices designed to block temptation. And this wasn't always punishment. Sometimes it was a spiritual flex. Other times it was desperation, or delusion, or a very awkward misunderstanding at a guild meeting. But first, let's take a torch and shine it on the legend's origins. The chastity belt, as a concept, likely predates its physical invention. The earliest literary hints come from the 12th century, nestled in poems and sermons warning of lustful ruin. The devices themselves, though, those began to crop up in records centuries later. Some claim as early as the 1400s, though even that's debated. Historians still argue whether many of the medieval examples we have were real or just imaginative fabrications from later collectors with, let's say, specific tastes. Now imagine a merchant's stall in Florence, somewhere around the year 1460. Silks sway gently in the breeze, glass trinkets glitter in the sunlight, and behind the counter, under a linen cloth, something metallic waits. A pair of iron briefs, complete with locks and a crudely filed heart motif on the front plate. You wouldn't be the first to mistake it for a cooking implement. In these early days, chastity belts were rumored to be gifts, often expensive, custom-crafted ones, bestowed by men and women alike, sometimes exchanged between lovers or monastics, trying very hard to stop being lovers. You, stumbling past this market stall, might overhear a whisper. He wears it to keep the devil's hand off his flesh. You might glance over and catch a nervous smile from a man holding a small iron key on a leather cord. Here's the thing. While some belts were allegedly locked by a partner, many were worn voluntarily. Men, particularly those in religious orders, would strap them on as a gesture of extreme piety. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of deleting every social media app and locking your phone in a drawer just to resist temptation. Except, made of cold, chafing steel. There's one curious case recorded in a faded monastic logbook from Germany. A young friar, newly inducted, allegedly requested a belt be forged for him after a vivid dream involving a talking swan, a burning orchard, and Saint Cecilia rolling her eyes. The dream sequence, hazy. The metalwork, very real. His belt reportedly had Latin inscriptions, "Conten me, Domine," meaning "restrain me, O Lord." It also had a hinge that creaked every time he bent to pray. Not ideal. There's another layer here too. In an age where physical urges were seen as sins threatening the soul, some thought it safer to eliminate the risk altogether. Better to be uncomfortable than to burn in hell, right? And so, from the 13th through the 15th centuries, Pockets of ultra-pious men embraced the idea. They didn't just want to stay pure, they wanted it visible, provable, and ideally audible, thanks to jangling keys and creaking buckles. But it wasn't just cloistered monks and guilt-ridden nobles. Even laymen, particularly those influenced by fringe ascetic sects, occasionally joined the locked ranks. Some did it during fasting seasons, others after the death of a spouse. There's an awkwardly charming tale from Normandy about a widowed baker who wore one until he no longer dreamed of his wife's warmth. It took 6 years. The village blacksmith gave him a discount. Of course, some saw this all as absurd. Satirists had a field day. One ballad from the late 1400s mockingly describes a knight whose belt rusted shut after a muddy joust, forcing him to bathe in vinegar for 3 days. Another mentions a tailor who claimed the device enhanced his posture and humility, though whether he meant that literally or metaphorically is anyone's guess. It's important to understand that the belt wasn't always what we imagine. Some were made of leather reinforced with brass. Others were simple cages, more symbolic than secure. And many were likely never worn at all, but crafted for display, like relics or conversation pieces. A few modern researchers even argue the whole concept was exaggerated by Victorian collectors obsessed with scandalous artifacts. One curator famously restored a supposed 14th century mail belt in the 1800s, adding spikes that weren't originally there. He later admitted they made it more interesting for museum goers, but whether real or embellished, the idea gripped the medieval imagination. It was part control, part performance, a physical act to prove an internal struggle, something that could say, "Look how committed I am," without needing words. And let's face it, medieval life was full of public performance, processions, penance, pilgrimages. Why not chastity armor? You start to notice it now, as you move through the shadowy alcoves of this imagined medieval world. The obsession with guarding purity wasn't just spiritual, it was also political. Kings and popes praised chastity as strength. Weakness of the flesh? That could cost you influence, trust, even a crown. Locking yourself up, literally, became a weird sort of flex. A way of saying, I am not like other men. Even if, in practice, it squeaked when you walked. And here's the twist. The further you dig, the more you see the overlap with modern ideas. Not the metal, hopefully, but the motives. Fear of desire, shame about the body, the need to prove control. These are very old themes, still echoing quietly in the corners of today's world. It's not all that different from putting parental locks on your own laptop, or deleting old texts just so you don't read them again at midnight. So tonight, as you lie there beneath your blanket, picture this: a flickering candle in a drafty monk's cell, a belt, cold and awkward, tucked beneath wool robes, a key on a thread resting on a bare chest. Outside, the wind howls. Inside, a man breathes slowly, eyes closed, whispering a prayer against temptation. It's strange, it's a little sad, it's more common than you'd think, and it's only the beginning. You keep moving down that stone corridor, the light growing dimmer, the walls narrowing. Somewhere in the distance, the low murmur of chanting floats through the air. Gregorian, slow and repetitive. The kind of thing you could fall asleep to if the monks didn't sound quite so intense. It's time to step deeper into the mindset of the Middle Ages, where every twitch of your conscience might have been the devil, and every bodily impulse felt like a personal failing. Welcome to a world where even dreams could damn you. You pause in front of a worn oak door, carved with a simple cross and nothing else. Push it open. Inside, a monk kneels on cold stone, whispering Latin so softly it might be mistaken for breathing. He wears a robe that smells of incense and damp wool. What's hidden beneath it isn't something he'd talk about out loud, but yes, it might be a chastity belt. And if so, he probably asked for it himself, because here's the uncomfortable truth. In medieval Europe, guilt wasn't just an occasional visitor. It moved in, redecorated, and started charging rent. particularly in monasteries, where religious life meant renouncing not only possessions but pleasures of any kind. And while the church was always divided over how harsh to be about such things, many monks and friars took their vows with a kind of anxious seriousness that sometimes led to, well, hardware. Sexual purity wasn't just a virtue, it was an obsession. The early church had long taught that the body was weak, and that desire, particularly male desire, could destroy the soul. Nighttime emissions, erotic dreams, even fleeting thoughts could be seen as spiritual setbacks. Some monks documented these things meticulously, like tracking a fever. Others punished themselves when the thoughts came unbidden, wearing hair shirts, whipping themselves, or, yes, donning chastity devices to block even the possibility. You might be wondering, didn't they just pray harder? Sure, but prayer doesn't always drown out biology. And so, some turned to more creative methods. One 14th century text from a Cistercian abbey includes passing mention of metal girdles for wayward flesh, worn under robes during seasons of temptation. Historians still argue whether that meant actual belts or just metaphorical language, but either way, it paints a clear picture of the mindset. The body wasn't trusted. It had to be restrained. Some monks referred to their urges as the little dragon, which sounds oddly adorable until you remember they were actively trying to slay it. This brings us to the concept of custodia corporis, the idea that the body must be guarded like a castle, lest the enemy sneak in. That enemy? Lust, always knocking. There were guides written specifically for young monastics on how to fight the heat of the blood. Cold baths, sparse meals, long walks barefoot in the snow, and, in more extreme cases, the use of painful or restrictive devices. Now, chastity belts didn't necessarily look like what you're imagining. Not the clunky, padlocked contraptions from cartoons or Victorian cabinets. The few male versions that have survived, though their authenticity is hotly debated, are less dramatic. Some resembled tight metal briefs with small ventilation holes and primitive locking mechanisms. Others may have been soft leather reinforced with metal strips, meant more to discourage than to actually prevent. Sort of like a medieval, "Are you sure about this?" button. A fringe tidbit here. One German account from the 15th century refers to a device called the quiet cradle, a padded, belted undergarment worn by a particularly devoted friar who wished to silence the stirrings of Adam. You can almost hear the embarrassment in the scribe's ink. And let's not forget the role of dreams. Nocturnal sins, as they were known, plagued the pious. Some monks were convinced that demons, particularly female ones, tempted them in their sleep. There's a whole category of medieval art that depicts these dream visitations. Shadowy figures perching on chests, whispering blasphemies into ears. One terrified monk even carved a warning above his cot, "Noli me tangere," do not touch me. It wasn't always so severe, though. In less strict orders, these devices were viewed with skepticism, even mockery. Some abbots cautioned against the theater of restraint, warning that those who tried too hard to show off their purity might be masking something darker. In one recorded sermon, a bishop asked, "Who is more holy, the one who needs a lock, or the one whose door stands open but never tempts the thief?" A fair point. There's a broader cultural picture forming here, too. The High Middle Ages were marked by increasing tension between natural human instincts and enforced religious ideals. And while the church didn't mandate chastity belts, it absolutely cultivated the kind of spiritual anxiety that made them appealing, especially to those already leaning toward asceticism, a lifestyle of strict self-denial, where every comfort was suspect. And here's where it gets interesting. The chastity belt didn't always symbolize weakness. Among certain devout communities, it was seen as a badge of discipline. To suffer was to grow closer to God. To endure discomfort was noble. There were even occasional rumors of sainthood linked to extreme self-control, though, notably, not a single confirmed saint is listed as having worn a chastity belt, unless you count metaphorical ones, which medieval writers were fond of imagining. Picture this: a chilly stone dormitory at dawn. A row of sleeping friars, one of whom rustles uncomfortably under his robe. Maybe it's the belt digging into his thigh. Maybe it's just the guilt again. But in that early morning silence, he believes he's doing the right thing. That every ache is a kind of prayer. Let's take a short detour now, back to the city streets, where rumors about monastic life swirl like chimney smoke. You'd hear stories at the baker's stall, or whispered during confession. Some believed monks locked themselves away, not just mentally, but physically, with keys held by abbots or higher clergy. Was it true? Probably not. But the myth had legs. A popular joke from the period involved a novice who could not sit, nor stand, nor sin, lest the lock shout out his crime. It made the rounds in Parisian taverns and ended up carved on the side of a pew in one particularly irreverent chapel. There's something both deeply sad and strangely admirable in all this. These were men trying, however awkwardly, to live purely in a world full of temptation. To lock yourself away from the world is one thing. To try locking away your very nature, that takes a special kind of desperation or devotion. And let's not pretend this was a medieval-only issue. The roots of modern purity culture, celibacy vows, and body shame trace directly back to these echoing corridors. The tools have changed, apps, trackers, pledges instead of iron and straps. But the impulse, still there. The belief that desire must be controlled, not understood, managed, not accepted. So here you are, lying in bed, listening to tales of iron underwear and candlelit guilt. It's bizarre, yes, but oddly relatable. Who among us hasn't tried to outsmart our own instincts? To resist something we're drawn to? Maybe not with keys and hinges, but still, as you let your eyelids grow heavier, imagine the soft scrape of sandals down a cloister hall, a soft rustle of cloth, a monk stopping by his window to look out at the moonlit grass. His breath fogs the glass. Somewhere beneath his robe, a belt sits cool against his skin. Not punishment, but a choice, one he believes will help him rise above. Whether it worked or not, history isn't sure, but the stories linger, locked away but never forgotten. You're still wandering, deeper now. The stone underfoot turns uneven, worn smooth in the center by centuries of soft leather soles. The flickering torchlight plays tricks on the walls. Shadows dart, stretch, shrink. This part of the journey isn't about faith or fear. It's about identity. About how men in the Middle Ages looked at their own bodies, their urges, and the weight of expectation, and decided, for reasons as complicated as any TikTok rabbit hole, to voluntarily encase themselves in metal. It sounds ridiculous at first. Why would any man choose to wear a chastity belt? The easy answer, shame. The harder one, control. And the truth? Somewhere messy in between. You reach a heavy door with blackened hinges, push it open, and the air inside is strangely warmer. This is no monastery now. This is the private chamber of a wealthy nobleman. Tapestries line the walls. There's a wine jug on a carved oak table, and over near the fire, resting beside a set of fine leather boots, lies a belt. Not a sword belt, not a money belt, a chastity belt, for him. And yes, he probably paid a lot for it. By the late Middle Ages, the chastity belt wasn't just the stuff of monastery rumors. It had become a product, and where there are products, there are buyers. From nobles to merchants, some men began voluntarily donning these bizarre devices as personal symbols of virtue, self-discipline, or even elite status. In certain circles, especially among the pious rich, a chastity belt was a statement piece, not unlike a gold cross or a relic ring. But let's not over-romanticize it. Some of these men weren't so much devout as desperate. Maybe they'd taken a vow of celibacy after their wife died, or after a bad love affair soured into scandal. Some had joined lay religious orders that didn't require monkhood but encouraged severe self-restraint. Others, they were just terrified of disease, of sin, of what they might do if left unchecked. There's a mid-15th century letter from a Spanish merchant describing his iron discipline during Lent, which included locking himself in the garb of repentance. It wasn't just metaphorical. He'd had one custom made. These belts came in many forms. Some were surprisingly ornate, engraved with religious scripture or love poems, decorated with tiny gemstones, shaped with curves that suggested function was very much second to form. Others were harsh, utilitarian, and looked like torture devices, which, let's be real, they probably felt like. There's a quirk here worth noting. Some belts weren't made to stop anything. They weren't as secure as legend suggests. Instead, they acted more like deterrents, psychological barriers. Wearing one was a constant reminder of the vow, the promise, the fear, the guilt. It was about creating friction, literally and mentally. Kind of like putting your phone in grayscale to use it less. If grayscale came with thigh blisters and a padlock, and while you're standing in this nobleman's chamber, looking around at polished wood, embroidered cushions, and a bowl of dried figs, you start to wonder, was it really piety or performance? Was the chastity belt ever worn outside the bedroom? The answer, sometimes. Among certain groups, particularly those in fringe religious sects or esoteric circles, men wore them during fasts, pilgrimages, or public acts of penance. It was part of a grand spiritual theater. You weren't just pure, you were visibly, audibly, uncomfortably pure, and sometimes you wanted people to know it. Historians still argue whether these belts were truly functional or ceremonial. Some point to extant examples in museums, metal belts shaped for male anatomy with locking clasps and odd little vents, and argue these were real, worn objects. Others say they were built centuries later, perhaps during the Victorian era, as conversation pieces or moral warnings. The debate gets tangled in dusty provenance records, questionable dating techniques, and a general unease about the whole topic. Then there are those tiny belts, far too small for any adult. Toys, training devices, pranks? Or were they part of some now lost ritual for young men entering religious service? No one knows. The truth rusted away long ago, and modern interpretations are mostly educated guesswork. But those guesses still tell a story, and that story often swings between extremes. In some versions, these men are noble ascetics, battling the devil in the form of desire. In others, they're neurotic hypochondriacs locking themselves up out of fear of women, of disease, of weakness. And sometimes they're just lonely guys making very strange decisions in the name of virtue. Let's take a quick detour. Italy, 1475. A Florentine court record mentions a nobleman who refused to consummate his marriage, insisting his vow to remain pure for Christ could not be broken even for a wife. The court required evidence. The man appeared in court wearing a chastity belt beneath his silk robes, lifting them dramatically like a stage curtain to present his defense. The judges were unimpressed. The marriage was annulled. The belt was confiscated. The belt itself? Likely destroyed, though rumors say it was later used as a wine bottle holder in a tavern. Not every story ends so theatrically. Some of the quieter tales come from letters. Simple, handwritten admissions of struggle. A 15th century French artisan wrote to his brother, "This thing I wear each night, it brings peace, though not comfort." That one sentence speaks volumes. He wasn't proud, he wasn't preaching, he was just trying to sleep. There's a tenderness in some of these stories that complicates our laughter. Because while it's easy to mock the idea, ha ha ha, iron undies, it's harder to mock the feeling behind it. The anxiety, the discipline, the desire to be better, even when the method seems ridiculous. And then, of course, there were the inventors, the smiths, the tinkerers. You can't have demand without supply, and some artisans became specialists in protective garments. There are sparse records of blacksmiths in Nuremberg and Ghent who quietly advertised chastity-related services. Most were discreet, working off the books, charging steep prices for commissions they claimed were for carnival performances or mystery plays. Sure, of course, at least one of these blacksmiths, an apprentice named Willikins, apparently wore one himself for practice. Whether that's true or just a dirty joke that survived the centuries, it's hard to say. But the image of a teenage apprentice hammering iron plates while wearing a belt himself is strangely poetic and slightly clunky. It's worth remembering that the culture of the time didn't exactly promote emotional expression. So instead of talking about fear, desire, grief, or confusion, men often acted those feelings out through rituals, symbols, and sometimes strange inventions. A chastity belt for a man wasn't just an object. It was a confession, a sermon, a silent scream for help, or a quiet pat on the back. By now, your eyes might be getting heavy. That's okay. Let the image settle. A nobleman's fire dying to embers, the distant bark of a castle hound, the gentle creak of a belt buckle as someone rolls over in their bed of furs and linen. Tomorrow, he'll wake up, unlock it, bathe, and maybe decide to wear it again. Or maybe not. But tonight, he chose restraint. Not because someone forced him, but because somewhere deep in his chest, below the layers of pride, fear, and polished armor, something whispered that self-control was nobler than conquest. Whether it was wisdom or madness, we'll never know. But we'll keep walking. The corridor stretches on. More rooms, more stories, more rusted choices. The corridor gives way to a marketplace now. You step out into the soft gray of a misty morning, where the air smells of fresh bread and wet stone. Merchants are just beginning to set up, rolling carts into place, tugging canvas awnings over wooden frames, muttering to one another as they unpack bundles of silks, spices, and, strangely enough, metal undergarments. Yes, right there, between the woolen stockings and apothecary herbs, a small wooden stall proudly displays what appear to be chastity belts. Not locked in shadowy monastery closets, not hidden away in a noble's chambers, but right here, sold like any other wearable. This is where the whole business of modesty meets the clang of cold commerce. Because chastity belts, especially for men, weren't just whispered about behind cathedral doors. At a certain point in history, they were marketed, crafted, bought, even in some cases, proudly shown off. You see a young apprentice hold one up, grinning, shaking it so it clinks. A baker's wife nearby snorts and turns away, but the smith behind the stall, he doesn't flinch. He just says, "Hand-forged, stainless, no refunds. Welcome to the strange little corner of medieval trade where morality became merchandise." And as strange as it sounds, this was not entirely uncommon. In larger medieval cities, Florence, Nuremberg, Paris, you could find entire markets dealing in unusual goods, relics, indulgences, potions for chastity and love, and in some cases, physical devices designed to reinforce moral behavior. Some belts were subtle, padded leather pouches reinforced with narrow iron slats, marketed as night guards or pilgrim's protections. Others were far more overt, with ornate designs and elaborate locking systems. One known example from late 15th century France had 3 separate clasps and a key shaped like a crucifix. Functional, maybe, impressive, definitely. But this was also where the line between utility and spectacle started to blur. You didn't just buy a chastity belt, you made a statement. You declared yourself above temptation, or at least committed to fighting it. And just as often, you declared how much you could afford. These devices weren't cheap. The more intricate the design, the higher the price. Metal workers often charged by the hour, and more decorative belts could take weeks to finish. There's a particularly odd record from Milan of a wealthy magistrate who commissioned a pair of belts, one for himself, one for his scribe, matching, with filigree. Rumor says the scribe never wore his. Rumor also says the magistrate never removed his. People talk, and it wasn't only about personal virtue. Some belts were gifted. That's right, given as tokens of piety, penance, or even bizarre affection. A widow might present one to her late husband's brother as a way of saying, "Stay pure until you remarry." A guild leader might require a belt as part of a penitent's punishment after an affair. One letter from a bishop to a young nobleman offers a contrivance of modesty, so you may war not only against sin, but against yourself. If you're cringing good, that means you're awake. But here's where it gets even more slippery. Not all belts sold in markets were ever meant to be worn. Some were fakes, props, conversation pieces. There's decent evidence that by the late 1400s, some merchants sold display-only chastity belts, created not for use, but for shock value. A sort of medieval gag gift. They'd hang them above shop doors or feature them in parades of oddities. One Parisian merchant's ledger from 1493 includes an entry reading "Un ceinturon de pudeur pour le théâtre inutilisable." Translation: one belt of modesty for theater unusable. It's not hard to picture it. Actors hamming it up in morality plays, dressed in oversized, clanking belts, making exaggerated oaths of purity to the laughter of the crowd. Still, not everyone was in on the joke. Some belts made it into private homes, tucked away in dowries or gift chests. In some regions, they became symbolic objects, placed on altars during confession, or held by religious orders as a reminder of human frailty. One German abbey even kept a ceremonial chastity belt locked inside a glass box, only brought out on Ash Wednesday. Of course, for every belt forged with noble intent, there was another made to humiliate. As we'll explore more deeply later, chastity belts, particularly male ones, sometimes crossed the line from spiritual practice to public shaming. But even in those darker uses, you still see the same thread. The body as something to be controlled, fenced off, managed. Here's a slightly bizarre detail. Some merchants offered custom belts with built-in compartments, tiny drawers, lined with soft cloth, meant to hold relics or small charms. Because if you were going to lock up your body, why not protect your soul while you were at it? It's a strange mix of practicality and superstition, blessed by St. Hubert, one seller claims, as if a holy relic could somehow make an iron jockstrap more comfortable. Historians still argue whether many of these belts were sold sincerely or just as novelties. There's a strong case that many real chastity belts displayed in modern museums are, in fact, Renaissance or Victorian inventions, retrofitted fantasies of what people wanted the Middle Ages to be like. Especially during the 19th century, there was a boom in curiosity cabinets, private collections of odd or shocking items. Chastity belts were a hit. And if you couldn't find a real one, easy, just make one. Which brings us to an uncomfortable truth. Some of the most famous examples of male chastity belts were likely forgeries, crafted centuries after the fact, touted as genuine medieval relics, when in reality they were carefully aged with rust, soot, and a good story. Museums still struggle to verify their collections, often removing belts from displays quietly, once proven to be inauthentic. But here's the thing. It doesn't make the story less real. The belts might be fake, but the beliefs were not. The anxiety, the self-discipline, the social performance, that's the real metal here. And you, in this market square of memory and myth, can see the whole thing playing out like a scene from a play. A merchant shouting deals, a curious nobleman testing the weight of a belt, a monk shaking his head disapprovingly, a couple giggling as they pass, whispering something scandalous. It's part absurdity, part tragedy, and that's exactly what made it such a perfect product for its time. The chastity belt walked a line between shame and pride, devotion and mockery, and for men especially it became a kind of paradoxical armor, To wear it was to show weakness, but to choose to wear it, that was strength, or so they told themselves. As the market begins to quiet and the fog starts lifting, you wander back into the alleyways beyond the square. You pass a tailor stitching a hem, a butcher washing blood off his boots, and there, by a crumbling wall, a small child playing with a metal ring like it's a toy. Maybe it once held something more serious. Maybe it was just scrap. Either way, the story moves on. The clang of commerce has faded, and we return to quieter corridors. But the lesson lingers. Even purity was for sale. Even guilt had a price tag. And somewhere, someone jingled when they walked. Not because they sinned, but because they were trying not to. Your feet crunch softly on gravel now. The market behind you. The voices fading into memory. The path winds toward a hillside, lined with crooked trees and an old stone outpost. Half ruined, half restored. There's a dusty wooden sign swinging gently in the breeze. It reads Deo et Militiae, for God and the military. You've entered the world of knights, and what a strange armored world it was. When you think of a knight, you might imagine chivalry, jousting tournaments, broadswords, maybe the occasional dragon if you've been binging fantasy shows. But reality, much colder, wetter, smellier, and deeply complicated when it came to sex. Because knights were torn between two opposing forces, the duty to protect the weak and the impulse to embrace the flesh. And sometimes, in that clash of steel and shame, the chastity belt made a surprise appearance, on the men, not just the women. You step into the outpost's shadowed interior, walls hung with faded banners and dented helmets. A training dummy slouches in the corner, half-beaten and full of hay, and right beside it, a curious object lying in a wooden chest. Not a gauntlet, not a codpiece. A chastity belt, large, heavy, and clearly crafted for a man. It looks more like armor than undergarment, and in some ways, that's exactly what it was. Let's set the scene. The Crusades are raging. Men from across Europe are heading off to the Holy Land, spurred by religious fervor, promises of salvation, and a whole lot of royal posturing. And somewhere, among the banners and blessings, the first whispers of the chastity belt emerge. Not for the men to put on their wives, but for the men to wear themselves. Here's the twist. While popular myth loves the image of knights locking up their ladies before heading east, some tales, though far rarer, suggest that a few knights locked themselves up. Why? To remain pure, to resist temptation during years-long campaigns in foreign lands, to avoid disease, or maybe just to survive the kind of religious guilt that hit especially hard when you were sleeping in a tent beside 30 other men. There's a fragment of a knight's journal from the 12th century, probably apocryphal but interesting nonetheless, in which he writes, "I gird myself for battle in both steel and silence, for what is man if ruled by his urges?" It's poetic, it's dramatic. It's also the kind of thing a guy might write right before realizing how hard it is to sit on a horse while locked in iron briefs. Still, the idea stuck around. Whether through real practice or just persistent rumor, the notion of a belted knight entered the cultural bloodstream. Some crusading orders, particularly the more zealous ones like the Knights Templar or the Hospitallers, placed strict restrictions on behavior, sex especially. Members were expected to remain celibate. That alone probably didn't require a belt, but for those already inclined toward extreme piety or paranoia, strapping one on might have seemed like the next logical step. One fringe tidbit, a marginal note found in a manuscript from a Teutonic knight outpost in the Baltic, suggests that a young recruit was given a belt by his superior to remind him of the higher war. Whether this was metaphorical or literal is unclear, but the phrase alone suggests that the association between chastity and warfare was strong. After all, medieval life loved a good metaphor. Your body was a castle, sin was the invader, purity was the moat. It's worth noting, too, that the line between armor and undergarment was already blurred. Knights wore layers. a padded gambeson, chainmail, plate. Cod pieces were standard, and some were extravagantly large, sometimes stuffed with cloth, sometimes hollow, sometimes decorative to the point of absurdity. So why not add another layer, a locked one? The problem, of course, was logistics. Wearing an actual chastity belt beneath a full suit of armor sounds like a nightmare. Chafing, overheating, bathroom issues, none of this was ideal. That's one reason historians remain skeptical of actual usage in the field. Many suspect that belts linked to knights were more symbolic, perhaps worn in ceremonies or during periods of penance, rather than on horseback into battle. Still, the image of the pure knight endured. Chastity, after all, was considered a virtue for warriors, especially those fighting under a religious banner. There was this romantic ideal of the man who served only God, who resisted not just his enemies, but his own flesh. And chastity belts, whether real or rumored, became part of that mythology. There's an amusing legend out of southern France about a knight who claimed to wear a belt forged by a bishop himself. He swore it kept him safe during battle, and that his loins were as guarded as his soul. According to the story, the belt eventually had to be sawed off after he developed a rash from riding in the sun too long. Not exactly a heroic end, but hey, he stayed chaste. But not all chastity belt-wearing knights were so noble. Some records, likely exaggerated, suggest that certain lords used belts to punish their squires, as a lesson in obedience or an attempt to curb inappropriate behavior. These tales are rare, and often come from satirical poems or court anecdotes. Still, the fact that they existed at all shows how the idea of belting wasn't limited to self-control. It could also be imposed, with all the power dynamics that implies. That's something to keep in mind. While some men chose the belt as a tool of spiritual practice, others experienced it as a kind of coercion. Whether by social pressure, religious guilt, or direct authority, chastity belts weren't always worn willingly. And in those moments, they stopped being symbols of discipline and became instruments of shame. And then there's the cultural tension at the heart of it all. Knights were supposed to be paragons of virtue, yet medieval literature is full of tales of lusty crusaders, romantic escapades, and battlefield dalliances. There's a hilarious 13th century tale of a knight who preaches chastity by day, only to sneak into a washerwoman's tent at night, belt conspicuously left behind. Hypocrisy is older than history after all. Still, the knight in the belt remained an enduring image. Sometimes mocked, sometimes revered, sometimes both. Satirical ballads poked fun at the squeaky steps of armored virtue, while religious texts praised those who fortified their flesh with divine metal. The contradiction never fully resolved, and maybe that was the point. Now, as you leave the outpost and descend back toward the wooded path, take one last look at that rusted belt beside the training dummy. Maybe it was worn by a man trying to serve two masters, his faith and his reputation. Maybe it was just left behind as a joke. Either way, it tells you something important about how far people will go to prove something invisible, something inside. And that's the legacy of the belted knight. Not the armor, not the oaths, but the struggle between what you want and what you're told you should be. That battle never really ended. The path curves now, leading you toward more stories, some sad, some strange, some full of iron and misunderstanding. So take a deep breath. Let the forest sounds return. A bird chirps, a twig snaps, and somewhere, just out of sight, someone walks with a key around their neck, convinced it makes them better. The trees thicken. Leaves rustle overhead in slow, sleepy motion as the evening sets in around you. The light softens, dappling the path in gold. You step off the trail now, ducking through a break in the brush, and there it is, a weathered chapel on a lonely hillside, its bell long silent, its windows mossed over. But inside, there's the echo of something stronger than silence, belief. And belief, as you've noticed by now, has a habit of locking people in. This is where the journey turns inward, away from knights and courts, and toward a stranger, quieter world. The world of the self-deniers, the zealots, the fringe holy men who believed the way to spiritual salvation was through personal suffering. If the soul was to rise, the body had to be conquered, and the chastity belt, for men, was one of their more peculiar weapons. The chapel door creaks open. Inside you see benches warped with age, an altar littered with dust, and in the back, near the faded relic of a saint's arm bone, a wooden chest carved with floral vines. Open it, and what do you find? Another belt, small, severe, and adorned with scripture. This one bears an inscription in Latin, per dolorem ad gloriam, through suffering to glory. Some men believe that, with everything in them. You've probably heard of flagellants, those religious zealots who whipped themselves publicly, hoping to purge sin through pain. But self-flagellation was just one piece of a larger medieval movement that prized suffering as a form of divine purification. They walked barefoot through snow, they slept on cold stone floors, and in more extreme cases, they locked their bodies in literal cages. Men in this world weren't just resisting temptation, they were actively seeking to erase it, to kill desire entirely. And for some, the chastity belt was the last line of defense. Not just a guard, but a personal reminder of their fight against the flesh. There's a curious account from Bohemia of a hermit who lived for years in the woods outside Prague, reportedly wearing a chastity belt of his own design, crafted from woven bark, bronze wire, and scraps of chainmail. It wasn't particularly secure, but that wasn't the point. His journal, preserved in part by monks who found his shelter after his death, describes his efforts to cage the lion within, as he put it. The lion, of course, being his libido. Historians still argue whether these men were mentally ill, spiritually enlightened, or simply victims of a society that feared the body as much as it worshipped the soul. Maybe all three. But what's certain is that their practices existed, even thrived in certain circles. There were communities of self-deniers, lay brotherhoods and ascetic orders, who encouraged extreme forms of chastity. And while most stuck to fasting, prayer, and cold water, there were always those who took it one step further. One fringe tidbit. In a now-lost religious manuscript catalogued in Vienna's Hofbibliothek in the 1700s, a marginal note refers to a group of key-bearers, laymen who voluntarily wore belts during times of high temptation and would gather annually to exchange stories and, oddly enough, belt-polishing tips. Were they real? A joke? A metaphor? Like most things in this story, we'll never quite know. But even within the church, there was tension. Some theologians warned against excessive self-mortification. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, argued that extreme denial could be just as sinful as indulgence if done for vanity or show. Others, however, praised the practice, especially if it was secret. A hidden belt worn in silence was considered a true sign of humility. That humility sometimes came with a cost. Imagine the discomfort, the chafing, the risk of infection. Hygiene in the Middle Ages was hit or miss on the best of days. Some men reportedly lined their belts with cloth soaked in vinegar or infused with herbs to prevent irritation. Others, they bore the pain as part of the penance, and the belts themselves grew stranger over time. Some included spikes, not to injure, but to discourage movement. Others were engraved with prayers or warnings. A particularly grim example from Bavaria has the phrase, "Be gone, fire of lust," etched along the waistband, as if to shout down the body's impulses every time it stirred. Yet there was a kind of nobility in their madness. These were not violent men, not sadists or tyrants. They were quiet, distant, inward-looking, men who believed that locking themselves away could bring them closer to heaven. Whether they succeeded is a question beyond history, but the attempt, that left a mark, sometimes literally. In 1432, a chronicler in Florence described a local penitent known only as Pietro of the Nails. He earned the name because he lined his belt with short iron studs to remind himself not to desire. Over time, the belt rusted into his skin. Physicians had to cut it away. He reportedly cried, not from pain, but because he felt unworthy of removal. You sit now on one of the old chapel benches, listening to the stillness. There's something heavy about this part of the story. The other belts, the ones worn by knights or sold in markets, were public, theatrical. These were private acts of devotion or desperation. You feel the weight not just of iron, but of loneliness. Because behind every self-imposed chastity belt was a man grappling with who he was allowed to be. The medieval world didn't offer much room for emotional nuance. If you were tempted, you were weak. If you gave in, you were damned. So the belt became a way to silence the noise, to take control of the narrative, even if that control came at a high cost. And still they persisted. From England to Hungary, Italy to Poland, records, fragmentary, cryptic, sometimes doubtful, mention men who chose to live this way. Not many, not often, but enough to leave a thread in the fabric of history. A thread rusted and fraying, but still faintly visible if you look closely. And if there's something tragic about that, there's also something very human. These men were afraid, not just of punishment or hellfire, but of themselves, of what might happen if they didn't take action. They locked themselves up not because they hated pleasure, but because they feared it had too much power. You rise now and walk toward the altar, passing a broken votive candle holder. A chill slips in through the stone. Outside, the wind picks up. You can almost imagine one of those key bearers, sitting here in the dark, fingers clutching a rosary in one hand, the cold press of metal against skin beneath his robe, praying to feel less, or more, or simply nothing at all. That's the strange legacy of the belted believers. They weren't trying to make history. They were trying to disappear into purity. And yet, here we are, talking about them centuries later, rust and all. So as the chapel fades behind you, and the path winds down again toward more earthly stories, keep their quiet conviction with you. Not because it was right, but because it was real. The path leads down from the hillside chapel into a strange little valley, where the grass grows too tall, and the trees lean just a little too far in. There's a chill now, not from the breeze, but from something else, a change in the air. Because as you step into the next stretch of this journey, you're also stepping into a kind of illusion, or maybe more precisely a reinvention. We're leaving the Middle Ages now, well, mostly. The calendar turns, the armor rusts, and the old monks are long gone. But something odd begins to happen in the centuries that follow. Somewhere in the dusty salons of Victorian London, in the velvet-draped studies of bourgeois Paris, and in the increasingly anxious medical journals of the 19th century, the chastity belt is reborn, not as a tool of piety, but as an object of fascination, and often moral panic. You're standing now in a museum, somewhere around 1865. The parquet floors gleam. The air smells faintly of oil paint and floor polish. Glass cases line the room, and inside one of them, between an Iron Maiden and a set of surgical tools you don't want to look too closely at, sits a chastity belt, male-sized, shiny, dramatic, almost theatrical in its design, and the placard reads, Medieval Chastity Device, c. 1400. Except, probably not. This is where the story gets twisted, literally and historically. Because despite what that placard says, there's strong evidence that many of the chastity belts we associate with the Middle Ages were, in fact, 19th century creations, either outright fabrications or restorations that turned half-rusted fragments into shocking museum pieces. Why? Well, the Victorians had a few things going on: a love of the grotesque, an obsession with sexual purity, and a flair for melodrama. They looked back at the Middle Ages not as a factual era, but as a cautionary tale, and sometimes a fetishized fantasy. During this time, museums started collecting anything that could pass as medieval morality. They hunted down torture devices, religious relics, and yes, chastity belts. If they couldn't find them, they made them. Some curators freely admitted to enhancing pieces to make them more exciting. One even added fake Latin inscriptions to give a belt more gravitas. Another added spikes. For authenticity, he claimed. Sure, historians still argue whether even a single chastity belt, male or female, from the medieval period, survives in its original form. Most existing examples date from the 1500s at the earliest, and many show signs of later modification. A number of them were likely never worn at all. They're too clumsy, too heavy, too obviously designed for display, not discomfort. And yet, the myth persisted, and even grew. Victorian moralists used chastity belts as both a warning and a metaphor. They appeared in newspapers, penny novels, and public lectures. Men were told that without strict control, their desires would lead them to ruin. Belts, even if imaginary, symbolized what could be done to protect society from its own worst instincts. But of course, it wasn't just metaphorical. The 19th century gave rise to an entire industry of moral devices, and not just for women. Doctors and moral reformers, worried about the dangers of self-abuse, their term, not ours, began designing and marketing gadgets to keep men in check. Metal covers, padlocked briefs, and even elaborate contraptions with springs and alarms were patented and sold, often under the guise of medical treatment. One fringe tidbit. In 1876, an American inventor patented what he called the gentleman's anti-sin girdle, a device that promised to maintain virtue in sleep and silence. It looked like a cross between a fencing mask and a mousetrap. We don't know how many were sold. Hopefully not many. These devices were advertised in medical catalogs and discreetly sold through mail order. They weren't typically referred to as chastity belts, at least not publicly, but their function was the same, to lock the male body away from temptation, particularly at night, particularly during puberty, particularly when doctors and parents alike feared that a boy's future could be ruined by his own hand. So, if you're lying there thinking, this feels more absurd than anything we've covered so far, you're not wrong, but you're also not alone. Because this part of the chastity belt's journey, this invented memory of medieval piety, is still tangled in modern imaginations. Even now, some museums haven't removed the belts from their torture displays, even though the provenance is sketchy at best. Why? Because they're compelling, uncomfortable, weirdly magnetic, and because they allow us to project all sorts of things onto the past, our fears, our fantasies, our worst instincts. It's also during this period that the chastity belt begins to reappear in fiction. Gothic novels, satirical plays, even early silent films, always as a symbol of repression, of absurdity, or of tragic devotion. One 1880s melodrama features a male character who wears a chastity belt as penance for his unfaithfulness, only to lose the key in a boating accident. The rest of the plot, as you might imagine, involves increasingly desperate and ridiculous attempts to get it off. So where does this leave us? Well, back in our museum, you step closer to that glass case. Look again at the belt inside. It's smooth, unworn, too clean. The key lies beside it on a velvet pillow. There are no signs of use, no wear on the buckle. It's more theater prop than historical artifact. But that doesn't make it meaningless. Quite the opposite. Because the chastity belt, especially for men, was never just about the object itself. It was about what people believed the object meant. Purity, fear, devotion, control, embarrassment, and above all, the idea that our desires must be managed at all costs, even if it takes cold iron to do it. And isn't that the most Victorian thing of all? To turn anxiety into hardware, to wrap guilt in steel, to manufacture history just to make the present seem more righteous. You step away from the case now. letting the reflection of candlelight flicker across the glass. In the background, you hear the shuffle of other visitors, some snickering, some whispering, some reading the placards with a mix of awe and doubt. None of them quite sure if they believe what they're seeing, and honestly, that's fair, because maybe the chastity belt is less of a historical fact and more of a historical feeling. An object that says more about the people who made it, displayed it, and believed in it, than about the people who may have actually worn it. So as you leave the museum, coat collar turned up against the drizzle, remember this: not everything behind glass is real, and not every myth is a lie. Sometimes the rust is new, but the fear, that's ancient. Rain begins to patter lightly on the cobblestones as you leave the museum behind. The world feels washed, a little quieter, a little heavier. You pull your cloak, or maybe it's just a cozy blanket, tighter around your shoulders as the street curves down into an older part of town, the kind with crooked gutters, narrow alleys, and centuries of secrets still clinging to the walls like ivy. This is where law and morality start bumping elbows, where stories of chastity belts leave the monastery and the museum and start showing up somewhere much stranger, the courtroom. You duck beneath an archway and into a tiny, candlelit chamber. It smells of ink and wet parchment. A heavy ledger lies open on a desk, and beside it a pile of curious objects seized as evidence, including, yes, a chastity belt. This one dented, clearly used, and oddly familiar, because for all the myths and rumors, the chastity belt did occasionally show up in real historical legal documents, but not always in the way you'd expect. These weren't stories of noble knights or devout monks. No, these were disputes, accusations, punishments, moments when something deeply personal became painfully public. Let's start in 16th century Venice, where a merchant brought charges against his own apprentice, claiming the young man had tampered with a device of self-discipline. The merchant alleged that he had purchased a male chastity belt for protection during travel, but discovered the lock had been picked. The apprentice was caught with the key and, perhaps more scandalously, a poorly forged replacement belt, a crude one, painted gold. The court's final judgment remains unclear, but the fact that this case was even recorded tells you something. These devices weren't always private. And then there's the 1624 case from Strasbourg, where a tailor was fined for wearing a chastity belt as part of a public festival costume. The town's council, incensed, ruled that chastity-themed jesting was unsuitable for respectable citizens. The man's defense? It was not locked, which, admittedly, raises more questions than it answers. This brings us to an important point. Chastity belts, especially those worn by men, occasionally crossed into the realm of social theater and legal embarrassment. They could be used to shame, to punish, or to mock. In some rare cases, they were even cited in accusations of sorcery. Yes, sorcery. A fringe tidbit for you. A trial transcript from Würzburg, Germany in 1631 includes testimony from a man who claimed his neighbor cursed him, causing his chastity belt to lock permanently and refuse to open even with the key. The man swore he had been hexed by envy and was sealed shut by devil's will. The court, perhaps wisely, dismissed the case, but the belt itself was entered into evidence and described in unsettling detail. Still, not all legal references were bizarre. Some were heartbreakingly mundane. In Paris, an early 18th century court ruling involved a widowed woman who accused her late husband's brother of locking her son into a chastity belt to prevent temptation while under his apprenticeship. She argued it caused both physical injury and psychological distress. The court sided with her and ordered the removal of the device, but the young man reportedly refused to take it off, saying he felt safer this way. Cases like these are few and far between, but they exist. Quiet reminders that these devices weren't always cloaked in ritual or metaphor. Sometimes they were used with very real consequences, and the law, slow and squinting, tried to make sense of them the best it could. Of course, most courts had no specific laws about chastity belts. Why would they? The devices were rare, and even when they appeared, they were usually treated as novelties or curiosities. But every now and then, one popped up in records, strange, uncomfortable, undeniable. In some places, their presence was treated as evidence of moral rectitude. In others, as evidence of deviance. It depended on the context, and, let's be honest, the mood of the judge. There's a haunting example from a Swiss canton in the late 1600s, where a man confessed under questioning that he had worn a chastity belt every day but Sundays, since the age of 14. Why Sundays? To be closer to God, he said. The court didn't charge him with a crime, they just asked him to stop talking, which raises a curious question. When is chastity a virtue, and when does it become a problem? That's where law meets culture. In a society obsessed with self-control, a chastity belt could be seen as a noble choice. But pushed too far, become too extreme, and suddenly it's a sign of madness, of sin, of something broken. And so, the legal records reflect this dance, between acceptance and suspicion, between dignity and discomfort. There's even an 18th century satire written in the form of a legal deposition. It describes a fictional defendant who wears a belt to silence the cries of Venus, and insists that every man should do the same. The judge, exasperated, orders the belt removed, only to discover it's been welded shut. The closing line of the play? Let him keep it then, for he hath married no one but his own silence. Dark, poetic, and probably the weirdest courtroom drama never actually performed. By now you might be wondering, why did courts even care? Because, as it turns out, the chastity belt, especially when worn by a man, became a symbol of something larger than morality. It touched on property, inheritance, even mental competence. In some cases, a man wearing a chastity belt might be seen as unfit to serve, to marry, to manage land. It wasn't just a personal decision, it was a public signal. And public signals, in a time without private life as we know it, mattered deeply. You leave the courtroom now, stepping back out into the drizzle. The sky is dimming, and the old stones shine slick and silver under the soft light. You pass a statue, a robed figure, hand outstretched, face worn smooth by time. There's no belt visible, just the suggestion of modesty carved into stone. But behind the statue, carved faintly into the base, someone has etched a crude little lock, a joke, a confession, a commentary. You keep walking, because the line between morality and legality is never straight. It curves like a cobbled alley. It echoes like old laughter in the corners of forgotten courtrooms. And somewhere along that path, a man once jingled as he walked, not because he sinned, but because someone else decided how he should live. The rain clears by the time you step out of the alleys. The sky opens into a pale lavender hush, and the world feels a little less tight, like it's just exhaled. You follow a worn gravel road now, one that curves gently past a crumbling wall and into a cloistered garden. The scent of rosemary and damp earth lingers, and somewhere close, bells begin to toll, not for service, just for time. This is where we talk about the clergy, not the dramatic monks with iron belts in their cells, but the priests, bishops, and holy men who lived in the world while claiming to rise above it. Men bound by rules they didn't always keep. Men who preached restraint, but sometimes needed help following through. And yes, some of them turned to the chastity belt. Not all, not many, but just enough to leave behind a trace, and just odd enough to make you blink twice. You walk beneath an arched stone walkway into a private clerical residence. It's quiet. The air carries the smell of candle wax and ink. This is not a monastery. It's not about isolation. It's about image, control, reputation. And that's exactly where chastity culture found another hiding place. Because the church didn't just demand celibacy, it turned it into a performance. Priests were expected to live above temptation, even while living among it. And for those who struggled, the solution wasn't always confession. Sometimes it was prevention. There's a letter dated 1482 from a bishop in Aragon advising a young priest to employ physical restraint during his novitiate, and to bind himself if need be, lest dreams or devils distract him. The phrase is vague. Was he recommending a figurative restraint, a mental one, or something more literal? Some historians think that's code for a belt. Others argue it was metaphorical guidance wrapped in stern prose. Either way, it reflects an anxiety very specific to the clergy. How do you preach control if you can't keep it? There are records of penitent priests locking themselves up during Lent, or during extended pilgrimages. In one case, a cleric in Cologne reportedly wore a self-fashioned leather and metal chastity belt during a 40-day fast, believing the added discomfort would intensify his prayer. He later described it in a private letter as the tightness of grace, but not all uses were voluntary. This is where things start to shift into more troubling territory. Because while some clergy chose to wear these devices as acts of devotion, others were ordered to, especially those with reputations. A few church councils, particularly in the late medieval and early modern periods, began quietly enforcing discipline on problem priests by encouraging measures of restraint. In other words, if you were caught with the baker's daughter too many times, you might find yourself belted by order, not by God, but by your superior. One fringe tidbit. A 17th century ecclesiastical handbook from Austria includes a checklist of corrective measures for young clerics struggling with chastity. Among the suggestions, vigorous morning prayers, isolation during feast days, and something called instrumentum continentiae, literally, instrument of continence. No further description is given, but the implications are obvious. It wasn't a rosary. Of course, not all priests took this seriously. Some mocked the idea. Others bent the rules. One particularly colorful account comes from a French vicar who allegedly wore a decorative chastity belt made of brass, not for purity, but to amuse the local choir boys. It's unclear how long he kept his post, or his dignity. Yet for every story like that, there's another of someone who truly believed the belt could help. There's the melancholy tale of Father Benedetto, a Sicilian parish priest in the 1500s, who reportedly locked himself in a handmade belt each night and handed the key to his housekeeper, not because he feared temptation, but because, after a single scandal early in his career, he never trusted himself again. That's what lies at the heart of this section: mistrust of the body, of the self, of the people tasked with being spiritual leaders. Chastity wasn't just about virtue. It became a way of managing fear. Fear of hypocrisy, of failure, of being found out. Historians still debate whether these clergy-focused belts were common or rare. The records are sparse and often shrouded in euphemism. The church didn't advertise such practices, but where evidence exists, it's often in the margins. An offhand note in a parish register, a disciplinary comment in a bishop's letter, a quiet burial where something metallic was left unspoken. Which brings us to one of the stranger facts in this long tale. Some male chastity belts have been found in church crypts. At least 2 examples, discovered in the 20th century, were recovered from tombs beneath small European chapels. Both were crude, unadorned, and clearly designed for male anatomy. One had rusted shut completely. The other was wrapped in linen, almost reverently. No names were attached, no explanations. Just the quiet implication that, at some point, someone in a collar thought they'd be buried more safely if they stayed locked. It's hard not to find that heartbreaking. Whatever the motivation, shame, piety, paranoia, the final image is of a man who lived and died with part of himself sealed away. But not all was somber. Some clerics turned the belt into satire. Medieval plays and manuscript marginalia occasionally include absurd images of priests chasing after women while dragging chains or belts behind them, mocking both their vows and their failures. One particularly risque drawing shows a group of monks trying to unlock a belt with a candelabra. Subtlety was not the strong suit of medieval humor. Even sermons sometimes mentioned chastity belts, though usually as metaphors. Put on the armor of God, they'd say. Gird your loins with truth. Most listeners understood the message, but some may have taken it literally, and who could blame them? The pressure was enormous. In a world where a slip could mean exile, or worse, some turned to physical methods just to stay on track. It was harsh, it was strange, but it was, in a way, understandable. You leave the clerical residence now, passing through the garden again. A candle flickers in a window above you, its flame steady despite the breeze. Somewhere behind that glass, a man once sat in silence, locked not by chains, but by expectation. And isn't that the quiet truth of it all? The chastity belt was never just a tool, it was a sign of fear, of discipline, of surrender. It whispered a promise. I will not fall, even when falling was human, even when the belt made no difference. You walk on, the bell's now distant. The path widens again, ready to carry you towards stranger stories still, where ink and iron blur, and monks and merchants give way to jokes, doodles, and delightful nonsense. Because if history is heavy, it's also full of laughter. And sometimes, the most sacred things are the easiest to mock. The road takes a gentler turn now, curving downhill into a patch of rolling meadow, dotted with half-forgotten stones and crooked wooden fences. There's a scent of grass after rain, a breeze soft enough to make you yawn. You've walked through castles and cloisters, through courtrooms and cathedrals. But this next stop, it's more playful, more peculiar, and definitely more ink-stained. Because if the belt was ever a symbol of purity or punishment, it was also, perhaps inevitably, a punchline. Welcome to the pages of medieval manuscripts, the margins to be specific, those wild whimsical borders where scribes, monks, and anonymous doodlers gave free rein to their imaginations. You know, the same guys copying out psalms and holy texts all day. They also had a thing for drawing rabbits jousting on snails, and occasionally, men in chastity belts. You step into a tiny scriptorium now. There's a monk at a desk, head bent low over vellum, quill in hand. His robe smells of smoke and old wool. But while his main task might be copying the Gospel of John, just glance at the margins. What's that near the bottom? A tiny armored figure, pants down, running from a goose wielding a stick. And yep, around his waist, something that sure looks like a chastity belt. This is the part of the story where the belt becomes less tool and more toy. Not literally, but artistically. Because the margins of medieval books were filled with jokes. And among those jokes, chastity belts pop up more than you'd expect. Men struggling with locks, keys floating just out of reach, monks caught with their belts tangled in thorns. In one particularly absurd drawing, a man uses a long stick to try to scratch inside the device, face twisted in agony. Historians call these types of images marginalia, and they're as chaotic as they are delightful. They rarely reflect official doctrine. Instead, they reflect what people whispered, laughed about, or snuck into the backs of their minds during long hours of copying and correction. And yes, some of them involve sexual anxiety, especially around men. One fringe tidbit. In a now digitized Flemish manuscript from the 14th century, there's an entire page border where a man in a tunic is being chased by a tiny devil, wielding a giant key. The man's trousers are clearly belted shut. Above the drawing, a tiny inscription reads, "He locked it up, but the devil still knew." Subtle? No. Effective? Absolutely. These images weren't created in isolation. They mirrored popular jokes, stories, and urban legends of the time. Traveling performers and tavern singers sometimes included chastity jokes in their acts. A common format? What do you call a man with no key and a clinking walk? Punchline. Either too holy or too married. These were not stories of real belt wearing, necessarily, but rather a cultural stew of anxiety, ridicule, and resignation. The belt, especially for men, became a way to poke fun at exaggerated piety, obsessive guilt, or comical self-denial. Picture the modern sitcom trope of the hopelessly repressed character. Now give him a key he can't find and a belt that squeaks. The marginalia wasn't just humor, though. Sometimes it was satire, a visual protest against the rigid sexual expectations of the church. One drawing features a bishop holding a chastity belt like a holy relic, while a peasant kneels before him, eyeing the object with suspicion. Another shows a man trying to saw off his own belt with a butter knife, while a small angel points and laughs. There's something oddly comforting about these drawings. They remind you that even in a time of sermons and severity, people still laughed at the absurdity of it all. They still questioned, mocked, and even empathized with those who tried too hard not to feel anything at all. And then there were the notebooks. Not just manuscripts, but loose papers, journals, and practice books where scribes trained their hands or vented their frustrations. In these pages, chastity belts show up as half-serious diagrams, sometimes with notes like impractical or not recommended for summer. One scribal handbook from 15th century France includes a rough sketch of a man in a belt, holding a scroll that reads, "Blessed is he who needs no locksmith." Of course, not everyone laughed. Some of the imagery borders on cruel, mocking those who couldn't live up to expectations, or ridiculing those who tried too hard. Chastity, especially when taken to extremes, became an easy target. A way to say, look at how far we've taken this thing, isn't it ridiculous? And that's part of the broader cultural shift. As the centuries turned, the belt moved from serious symbol to satirical object, from private struggle to public joke, and from moral ideal to comedic failure, which tells you something important. Humor was, and still is, one of the only ways people cope with the things they're most uncomfortable with. Sex, shame, repression. Whether in drawings, songs, or late-night mutterings over ale, the chastity belt, especially for men, gave people something to laugh about when the real topic felt too loaded to say aloud. One particularly curious find: a marginal note in a 15th century medical text from Salerno includes a tiny sketch of a belt with a puzzled-looking face drawn onto the front panel. The note beside it reads, "Caution, interferes with diagnosis." Whether this was a joke by a bored physician or a sincere complaint, we may never know. But it lives on, scribbled in the margins, rusted into history by laughter. And maybe that's the lesson here. No matter how serious the object, the story, or the sin, someone somewhere turned it into a doodle, a joke, a reminder that behind all the sermons and scandals, people were still just people, confused, embarrassed, hopeful, trying their best, and occasionally drawing a goose wielding a key. So as you leave the scriptorium, the candlelight flickering behind you, think about those scribes and their mischievous ink. Think about how they gave us a window not into official doctrine, but into everyday minds. Minds that saw a chastity belt not just as an object of fear or virtue, but as something deeply human, silly, sad, worth sketching in the corner of a sacred text. Because sometimes, the best way to understand the weight of history is to laugh at how badly it fits. The candlelight from the scriptorium still flickers in your mind as you walk on, the path now damp and lined with ivy-covered stones. The laughter from the margins still echoes faintly behind you, but what lies ahead? It's something foggier, more speculative, a place where belief, medicine, and magic tangle up like loose threads in an old tunic. This is the strange intersection of science and superstition, because as bizarre as chastity belts already sound, especially for men, it gets stranger when you realize how often they were discussed not in terms of morality, but in terms of health. That's right. There was a time when doctors, astrologers, and natural philosophers all weighed in on the question of how best to, well, keep it all under control. The setting? a cramped 15th century apothecary's workshop. Dried herbs hang from the rafters. The air smells of rosemary, beeswax, and something vaguely medicinal, possibly crushed leeches. A thick wooden table is littered with bottles, scrolls, and several diagrams, one of which shows the male anatomy surrounded by little stars and planetary symbols. And at the edge of the table, a small belt-shaped object, lined with copper and strangely warm to the touch. This is where medieval science meets chastity culture, and the results are as curious as they are confusing. Let's start with early medical theory. In medieval Europe, much of medicine was based on the idea of humors, 4 bodily fluids believed to govern everything from temperament to health. Too much black bile, you were melancholic. Too much yellow bile, angry. And if you had too much blood or phlegm, things got complicated. Sexual desire, naturally, was tied to these fluids, especially heat and moisture. The more heat in the loins, the more likely you were to sin. So how to cool things down? Physicians advised cold baths, restrictive diets, and long walks in the snow. But some also recommended physical barriers, devices that kept the genitals cool, restricted stimulation, and prevented any unwanted movement. Enter the chastity belt, with a pseudo-scientific endorsement. While few of these early belts were prescribed in medical texts, several were described as tools for managing nocturnal emissions or overactive temperament. Some belts were designed with holes or panels meant to be filled with cooling substances, like mint paste, vinegar-soaked cloth, or crushed pearl dust, which was thought to temper the fire within. One fringe tidbit: a 1497 German compendium of natural remedies includes an illustration of a male belt filled with moonstone dust and pressed against the skin to prevent hot dreams. Moonstone was thought to reduce lust and promote calm. Whether it worked is anyone's guess, but it definitely raised the bar for holistic remedies. And it wasn't just herbs and minerals. Astrology also played a part. Medical astrologers often created charts to determine when a man was most vulnerable to lust, based on the alignment of planets, especially Mars and Venus. One court physician in Burgundy even claimed that chastity belts should be locked only during the waxing of the moon, lest they cause imbalances in the body's flow. Whether he meant physical flow or astrological, it remains unclear. Possibly both. Then there were the alchemists. Alchemists, those oddball proto-scientists who tried to turn lead into gold, also dabbled in controlling the body's urges. Some believed that retaining one's vital essence, red semen, was necessary for spiritual transformation. They didn't use the word chastity belt per se, but several alchemical diagrams hint at methods of containment, often with mystic locks or metallic sigils drawn directly onto protective garments. In fact, there's a surviving 16th century alchemical grimoire that includes a design for a belt of iron modesty, complete with etched symbols and lunar markings. It reads less like an actual blueprint and more like a magical talisman, a wearable prayer against temptation. But even as science edged toward modernity, the idea of the chastity belt never quite disappeared. In early medical treatises of the 17th and 18th centuries, you'll still find occasional references to mechanical devices meant to curb male excess. Usually these were recommended for troubled youth, or those with a history of immoderate habits. In other words, teenagers. Some doctors proposed belts as last resort measures for boys who were thought to be overindulging in, well, themselves. And here's where things tip into moral panic territory. By the late 18th century, as Enlightenment medicine emerged, older beliefs about humors gave way to more clinical ideas. But the fear remained. The terminology changed from bodily heat to nervous stimulation. Unbalanced fluids became overactive nerves. But the belt? It stuck around, now justified not by spiritual purity, but by pseudo-medical logic, which oddly enough makes the chastity belt one of the few medieval artifacts that managed to survive multiple medical revolutions. Even as beliefs changed, the impulse stayed the same. Block the body, protect the soul, or now, the sanity. There's an infamous letter from a British physician in 1810 warning a father that his son's persistent tendencies toward nocturnal excitation could lead to madness, sterility, or death. His prescription: a light metal garment of restriction, to be worn nightly until the symptoms abate. The modern reader shudders, but at the time this was treated as sound advice, and yet the belt wasn't purely medicinal. Superstition never went away entirely. Even in the 1700s and 1800s, some people believed that wearing a chastity device could ward off spiritual danger, demonic possession, or even bad luck. Belt charms, small amulets stitched into the waistband, became a thing. Some were blessed by priests. Others were embedded with herbs or stones. One particularly strange example: a preserved belt from southern Italy features a sewn-in pouch containing dried lizard skin and a prayer to Saint Dymphna, patron saint of mental illness. Was it practical? Probably not. Was it believed? Absolutely. And that's what makes this part of the story so fascinating. The chastity belt was never just one thing. It slid between categories: moral, medical, mystical, an object of shame and of hope, worn by sinners and saints, mocked by scribes, praised by doctors, sold by charlatans, and buried with believers. So as you leave the apothecary workshop, the smell of herbs still clinging to your clothes, you can almost hear the voices of those ancient experts echoing behind you, all of them trying to explain the unexplainable, all of them trying to master the same unruly truth: that desire doesn't care about logic, that the body has a mind of its own. And sometimes, when people couldn't make sense of that, they reached for a belt. The path turns sharply now, slipping into a shadowy grove, where the trees grow close together, whispering secrets too old to matter. You brush aside a branch, step over a mossy root, and suddenly you're in the thick of it. Not forests or fog, but the tangled, thorny undergrowth of reputation. Here, belts weren't for virtue or vows, they were weapons. Welcome to the realm of mockery, slander, and deeply uncomfortable humor. Because for every monk who wore a belt in quiet penance, there was someone else, often louder, ready to turn that belt into a punchline, an accusation, or worse, a public humiliation. And while earlier sections tiptoed around the edge of embarrassment, this one dives straight in. Let's begin in a tavern. A smoky little place in 15th century London, with muddy straw on the floor and a minstrel in the corner, strumming something only vaguely musical. In the back, a man stands on a stool, reciting a bawdy poem that rhymes too well to be dignified. The punchline: a knight with a chastity belt who jingles whenever he lies. The room erupts in laughter, not because the joke is clever, but because everyone knows who it's really about. Chastity belts, especially when worn by men, became a kind of social shorthand, a jab, a jingle, an insult wrapped in metaphor. They weren't just symbols of purity, they were symbols of impotence, cowardice, self-importance, or just plain weirdness. If someone was too pious, bet he wears one of those. If someone was too uptight, lock and key down below, I'll wager. If someone cheated and got caught, should have worn his virtue. If someone didn't cheat, but everyone assumed they would, same deal. One fringe tidbit: a 16th century French pamphlet described a notorious trial where a man was accused of adultery but wore a chastity belt to prove his innocence. The belt, unfortunately, didn't fit, not even close. He was convicted anyway, and the belt became a prop in the courtroom, a symbol not of chastity, but of poor planning. And then there's the satire, whole genres of it. In 15th and 16th century Europe, morality plays and comedic pamphlets often included characters who wore or were mocked for wearing chastity belts. These were not highbrow affairs. They were ribald, raucous, and often cruel. One popular trope was the overly devout husband who locks himself up to resist sin, only to lose the key, or have his wife accidentally sell it at market. Another featured a jealous lord who belted himself out of distrust for his own servants. He ends the play locked out of his own device while his rival laughs from the wings. And then came the accusations, real ones, sometimes devastating. In several medieval and early modern defamation cases, chastity belts were invoked as insults. To accuse a man of wearing one, or needing one, was to challenge his masculinity, his authority, and sometimes his mental fitness. One 17th-century German farmer sued his neighbor for calling him the jingle priest. He won the case, but only after parading his own breeches before a jury. The fact that belts could be faked made things worse. A rival might claim you wore one even if you didn't, and if you denied it too loudly, well, that just made people talk more. Much like any powerful rumor, chastity belt jokes became self-sustaining, and the cruelty often targeted not the proud, but the anxious, the men who genuinely feared their own bodies, or whose beliefs made them stand out. That's what makes this part of the history a little harder to laugh at. Because for all the satire and scandal, there's a current of real pain running beneath it. Imagine a young man in a small village, awkward, pious, maybe a little eccentric. He takes a vow, he tries to follow it. Maybe he wears something, maybe he doesn't. But someone finds out, or thinks they do. And suddenly, he's not just the devout one, he's the joke, the punchline. You hear about Benedict? Locks himself up at night, they say. Says it keeps his dreams clean. Poor lad. Can't even sneeze without a clink. And once that story spreads, it never stops. One of the cruelest examples comes from a letter written in 1643 by a schoolteacher in Flanders. He describes a student, unnamed, who wore a homemade belt to resist temptation. When the other boys found out, they tied bells to his shoes and dubbed him Saint No Touch. They followed him, rang bells behind him, sang hymns in mockery. The teacher ended the letter simply. He did not return the next season. You can feel the heartbreak in those few words. The weight of being laughed at for trying to be good. The cost of a decision that seemed private, but wasn't. And yet, the mockery didn't just come from outside. Sometimes it was self-inflicted. Diaries and confessions include entries that sound almost like rehearsed apologies. A monk in 1492 writes, "I wear the belt not out of pride, but because my prayers are not strong enough." And you wonder, who was he trying to convince? Himself? His superior? Or maybe someone long gone, whose laughter still echoed. Still, the satire kept coming. Even into the 18th and 19th centuries, chastity belts remained popular in political cartoons and public ridicule. Men who were seen as too religious, too controlling, or too awkward were often drawn with exaggerated belts, keys around their necks, or buckles labeled fear and shame. The joke was always the same. You tried too hard not to be human. And yet, despite the mockery, the belts never fully disappeared. They persisted quietly on the edges. Worn by a few, whispered about by many. The fear of ridicule didn't erase the fear of sin. If anything, the two grew together. And that's the strange legacy of the chastity belt as a tool of shame. It was both cause and effect. You wore it because you feared being mocked, and then you were mocked for wearing it. The forest begins to open now, the trees thinning into soft gold light. You step into a clearing, the grass thick and cool beneath your feet. Somewhere behind you, laughter still echoes, not cruel, but distant. You can't tell if it's from a tavern or a court, or just a forgotten manuscript. But you hear something else too, a softer voice. The voice of the man who wore the belt. Not for show, not for attention, but because he thought it might save him. From sin, from shame, from himself, and maybe, just maybe, from being the joke. You leave the clearing behind, where the last echoes of mockery fade into silence. The sky's grown dimmer now, dipped in the quiet hues of evening, blue slipping into purple. The road beneath your feet becomes smoother, paved now, touched by the occasional lantern flickering to life. You're walking into a more familiar landscape, a more modern one. But even here, in the world of movies, sitcoms, memes, and reruns, the old iron ghost still lingers. This is where we peek behind the velvet curtain and ask, how did chastity belts, especially those worn by men, go from whispered confessionals and medieval market stalls to slapstick comedy and historical misfires on the big screen? Because let's be honest, when most people today hear chastity belt, they picture something more like a Monty Python gag than a museum relic. And almost always, it's worn by a clueless man, trying very hard to not be caught doing something impure. Let's rewind the reel a bit. The 20th century, particularly its second half, was a playground of historical comedy. Writers, screenwriters, and satirists latched onto the chastity belt myth like a rusted life raft. Why? Because nothing says absurd history like locking your trousers. In the 1960s, Italian director Pasquale Festa Campanile gave us The Chastity Belt, a bawdy period comedy where Tony Curtis plays a knight forced to wear an iron undergarment for reasons that unravel into increasingly farcical complications. It wasn't high art, but it struck a cultural nerve. Here was the belt, no longer sacred or shameful, but silly, a prop for slapstick and innuendo. Hollywood caught on, so did television. Soon, the chastity belt, male or female, became a recurring punchline. From Blackadder to The Simpsons, from sketch comedy to late-night talk shows, the belt was used to mock everything from religious repression to bad relationships. The very idea of someone willingly wearing one became shorthand for dysfunction, denial, or neurotic over-control. And if that someone was a man, even better for laughs. And here's the thing, most of it is wildly inaccurate, or at least wildly exaggerated. Historians still argue whether chastity belts were ever widely worn, especially by men. Most real belts we've discussed? Questionable origins. Even the best preserved examples are shadowed by doubt, with many proven to be 19th century inventions, Victorian embellishments, or straight-up fakes, crafted to feed the museum-going public's appetite for strange moral history. But that didn't stop the myth from spreading. In fact, once the image took root in pop culture, it bloomed like a vine through every medium you could imagine. Comic strips, stand-up comedy, children's cartoons, sanitized of course, music videos, Halloween costumes, you name it. Why? Because the image is irresistible. There's something inherently comical about the idea of an adult man being locked up against his will, or even worse, voluntarily. It triggers every insecurity about masculinity, self-control, fear of desire, and comedy, as always, thrives on discomfort. One fringe tidbit. In the 1990s, a British game show called Time Team included a fake segment involving a chastity belt excavation, played for laughs. The belt in question was clearly a modern fabrication, but the audience howled. Archaeologists weren't amused. Pop culture didn't just misunderstand the history, it replaced it. In most people's minds today, chastity belts have become symbols of over-the-top repression. They're no longer seen as tools of spiritual warfare or moral panic, but as comic relief. The anxious virgin, the overly protective boyfriend, the control freak parent, the priest who takes things too far, the nerd who can't be trusted alone with a magazine. And here's where it gets complicated. Those jokes aren't just about the belt, they're about the person in it. And that's where the stereotype gets sticky. Men in chastity belts, especially in fiction, are almost always depicted as pathetic, weak, helpless, laughable. And while that's played for comedy, it reflects something deeper. How modern culture still struggles with the idea of male vulnerability around sex. A man trying to control his desire? Funny. A man afraid of his own urges? Hilarious. A man trusting someone else with the key? Comedy gold. But underneath the laughter, there's something real. Because even if the belt itself is mythologized, the feelings behind it, the fear of failure, the weight of expectation, the shame of wanting something you think you shouldn't, those are still with us. You see it in purity culture, in online abstinence forums, in overly restrictive parenting advice, in the way people still talk about good boys versus bad boys, or how some men quietly struggle with desire they don't know how to express. The belt may be a joke now, but the control it represents, still here. And sometimes the joke isn't funny. There have been real cases, yes, even in recent decades, of men voluntarily wearing modern chastity devices as part of religious or psychological programs. Some join online communities. Some see it as a path to discipline, others as a lifestyle. Most keep it quiet for obvious reasons. And that's the other side of the cultural image. Because while media laughs, real people wrestle with these ideas in private. You won't find them in sitcoms. You'll find them in late-night forums, in anonymous blog posts, in whispered confessions to therapists, which raises an interesting question. If the chastity belt is funny in fiction, but heartbreaking in fact, where do we draw the line? Maybe we don't. Maybe we let the laughter exist, but remember it doesn't tell the whole story. Because pop culture doesn't owe us accuracy, but we owe ourselves a little curiosity. When you see a man in a comedy sketch clumsily waddling around in a cartoonish belt, key around his neck, maybe, just maybe, you'll think about the monks and misfits, the ashamed and the sincere, the ones who wore theirs in silence, and the ones who didn't, but were accused anyway. The belt on screen might be fake, the laugh track might be loud, but behind it all, there's a truth more rusted and more human than any punchline could capture. You stop now at a bench beneath a street lamp, the modern world buzzing softly around you. The road ahead leads to stranger places, some unsettling, some familiar. But for now, sit with the realization that sometimes, even the silliest myths carry heavy shadows. Because when history becomes comedy, it doesn't always leave room for compassion. And when the past jingles, we'd do well to listen to more than just the laugh. The buzz of the street lamp fades behind you now as you follow a narrow alleyway that leads into the present. Fully, finally, unmistakably. Cobblestones give way to sidewalk. Candlelight becomes LED glow. And somewhere in the distance, the hum of Wi-Fi signals mingles with the rustling of trees. You're no longer looking at a world of myths and manuscripts. You're in it now, right now, where the chastity belt, incredibly, still exists. Not in the way you might expect. Not hanging on a hook in a dusty cathedral or passed around at a Renaissance fair, though that happens too. No, this version is modern, sleek, stainless steel or silicone, marketed with product videos, reviewed on forums, delivered in discreet packaging, because, yes, the chastity belt, especially the male chastity belt, has made a comeback. You're walking now past digital storefronts, pop-up ads, scrolling banners, ergonomic design, fully adjustable, remote locking, you blink. Wait, remote? Yes, really. In the age of smart devices, chastity belts have evolved from medieval rumor to Bluetooth-enabled reality. This isn't science fiction, this is a niche, but very real subculture. Some call it male chastity, some call it orgasm denial, others simply refer to it as chaste life. Whatever the term, the core idea remains eerily familiar. Control the body, whether by discipline, device, or delegated authority. But today, it's no longer draped in the language of sin and salvation. It's expressed in terms of commitment, self-control, intimacy, power exchange, or in some cases, personal peace. Strange, right? The same object once tied to spiritual torment is now sold with phrases like relationship trust-building tool and mindful masculinity. One fringe tidbit. In 2019, a Chinese company released a male chastity device that could be locked via smartphone app. A few months later, a security flaw was discovered. Users were being locked in with no way to unlock the device remotely. It became a minor media scandal, The jokes practically wrote themselves. But underneath the headlines was a question nobody really answered. Who exactly is wearing these? The answer? More people than you'd think. Some are in long-term relationships where chastity play is consensual and negotiated. Others are solo users, drawn to the sensation of surrender, the clarity that comes with restraint. There are whole communities, online forums, support groups, even coaching services, dedicated to helping men live in chastity, sometimes for weeks, months, or indefinitely. And unlike the historical examples, this isn't always framed as punishment. Sometimes it's framed as freedom. Freedom from distraction, from compulsion, from societal pressure to always be performing a certain kind of masculinity. For some, it's a spiritual practice, though not always religious. Think of it as secular asceticism, men seeking simplicity, focus, even enlightenment, through self-imposed limitation. They wear the belt not because someone forces them to, but because it offers them structure in a world overflowing with options. Others are more candid about the erotic side. They find the denial itself pleasurable. The power dynamic, whether shared with a partner or self-regulated, adds a layer of control and thrill that speaks to something deep and deeply human. Now, to be clear, this is fringe, not mainstream. You're not going to see ads for these devices on national television, at least not yet. But it's not entirely underground either. Companies sell them openly. Podcasts discuss them. Social media accounts, under aliases of course, share tips, progress, and product reviews. One online user, posting anonymously, wrote, "I started wearing one during the workday to stop myself from scrolling certain apps. It worked. I didn't expect it to, but it made me feel clear." Another described it as a mindfulness exercise. You're always aware of your body, every step, every shift of movement. It brings you back into the present. Like yoga, except I squeak a little when I sit. Is it funny? Sure. A little. Is it extreme? For some, absolutely. But is it that different from the monks, the knights, the hermits, and the men in the margins? Not really. The technology has changed, the theology has faded, but the desire to control desire, that's still alive and well. Of course, there's also backlash. Critics argue that modern chastity culture reinforces unhealthy ideas about guilt and control, that it masks issues of shame, anxiety, or compulsive behavior, that it commodifies repression. And in some corners, those concerns are very real. Just like in the past, chastity belts can be used for self-harm, for coercion, or for hiding from deeper emotional truths, which brings us to an uncomfortable but necessary point. The modern revival, for all its packaging and polish, still lives in the shadow of everything we've walked through together, because no matter how futuristic the device, the fears it touches are ancient. Fear of temptation, fear of failure, fear of being consumed by your own wants. And just like in the Middle Ages, those fears don't vanish when you put on a belt. They just get quieter, muted in metal. There's something undeniably poetic about that. Something a little sad. And something, depending on how you look at it, oddly hopeful. Because if people today are still reaching for the same symbolic tools, maybe it means we haven't changed as much as we think. We still wrestle with the same questions. What does it mean to be good? To be in control? To be safe inside your own skin? And maybe, just maybe, we're getting better at asking those questions out loud. As you walk past the last glowing screen, the modern world humming behind you, the past walks beside you like a faint shadow. You pass no knights, no monks, no inquisitors or jesters, just people, just men, trying to be okay, trying to feel whole, trying to figure out what it means to live with desire, without being ruled by it. And whether they wear belts or not, their stories continue. Quiet, clinking, and entirely human. You're nearing the end now. The road stretches out in one long, quiet curve, bathed in the soft light of approaching night. The air is cool against your skin, with just a hint of moisture, like the world itself is exhaling. You've wandered through centuries of iron and implication, guilt and intention, satire and silence. And now, the final steps bring you to a place where all those stories rest. A little clearing, grassy, empty, quiet. The perfect place to ask the only question that still matters. What does it all mean? Because for all the devices we've explored, real, imagined, rumored, mocked, there's something undeniably human at the heart of the male chastity belt story. Not the metal, not the key, but the reason anyone would think to wear one in the first place. The need to control something that feels uncontrollable. From monks to merchants, knights to modern-day minimalists, the chastity belt has always been about more than just sex. It's been about shame, pride, protection, power. Sometimes it was an act of piety, sometimes a punishment, sometimes a private ritual no one else ever saw, and sometimes it was a weapon used to embarrass, to judge, or to isolate. But always, always, it was a response to a world that didn't know how to talk about desire, without either glorifying it or fearing it. You sit now in the grass, legs crossed, the breeze soft against your face. Let your mind drift back through everything you've seen. A monk clutching a key during morning prayer. A blacksmith shaping cold iron into something oddly tender. A courtroom where a belt became evidence of innocence or guilt. A market stall with a gleam of brass beneath the linen. A lonely scribe drawing jokes in the margins of the Book of Psalms. You've seen men lock themselves for God, for their wives, for their reputations. You've seen them do it for love, for fear, for fun, and for reasons even they couldn't name. And maybe that's the most revealing thing of all. The chastity belt, whether a physical device or a whispered idea, has never been just about denying pleasure. It's been about seeking control, order, safety. It was an attempt to draw a boundary where the soul ends and the body begins, a line that even now no one has ever really figured out. One final fringe tidbit before we wind down. A private letter from the late 1700s, discovered tucked into a family Bible, contains a curious closing line. The author, a schoolteacher, had apparently worn a home-fashioned chastity belt during Lent each year. He writes, "If I die before Easter, bury me still locked, that I may rise pure." We don't know if he was joking. We don't know if anyone honored the request. But we do know he wrote it down. It's quiet now, not just outside, but inside. All the noise of history, the sermons, the jokes, the hammering of iron, the courtroom whispers, has faded to a low hum. You begin to realize that for many of the men who wore these belts, the object itself didn't matter. What mattered was the gesture, the act of trying to be good, to be enough, to be stronger than the world, or their thoughts, or their own bodies. And yes, sometimes they got it wrong, sometimes they went too far, sometimes they became the joke. But the effort itself, that was real, that was human. So if you ever hear someone scoff at the idea of a man wearing a chastity belt, think of the faces behind the iron. The ones who trembled at their own dreams. The ones who laughed at their own failings. The ones who quietly, earnestly, believed that if they could just lock that part of themselves away, they might become something better. And whether that belief was brave or broken, it mattered enough to leave traces. Rusted, revised, remembered. Now take a breath. The journey's almost over. Let your body start to slow now. Sink a little deeper into your blanket. Loosen your jaw. Let your shoulders drop. You've walked through centuries tonight. Through cloisters and courts. Through gardens and gallows. Through whispers, symbols, laughter and silence. It's okay to feel a little heavy. That's what history does. It doesn't just tell us who we were, it reminds us who we still are. Curious, conflicted, tender, a little strange, always reaching for understanding, even if we use the oddest tools to do it. So breathe in, gently, and let that breath go. Let the imagery soften now. The iron belts and clinking keys, the flicker of torchlight in old halls, the rustle of pages inked with jokes and prayers. They're fading behind you, like footprints dissolving in fog. There's no need to hold on to them. All those men you met along the way, they're resting now. Their stories have been told, their secrets no longer so secret. Let them drift away like candle smoke. Feel the stillness settling in around you, like moss on stone, like silence in a chapel, like an answer you don't need to say out loud. And as your breathing evens, and the world goes dim, just remember, there's no need to lock yourself away to be worthy. Not tonight, not ever. You are already enough. Good night, traveler. Sleep well.